Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Blunt.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to call up three amendments en bloc. Amendment number 5, which is an amendment I should have my name on. Amendment number 23, which is an amendment for Mr. Stearns. And amendment number 66 for Mr. Pitts. And we would like to present those within the time limit and as one en bloc.
Without objection.
Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Okay, without objection, the three amendments will be considered in block. And further, without objection, the three amendments will be considered as read. And the gentleman from Missouri is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman. Let me first start with the amendment number 5, the amendment I have. This is an amendment where this simply would strike the additional performance standards for coal under this legislation. Mr. Chairman, by additional performance standards, your bill, the bill that you and Mr. Markey have, amends the Clean Air Act to create performance standards for new coal-fueled power plants. Section 116 of the bill imposes an additional emission limit on new coal-fired generating facilities. That section requires that in addition to the cap on emissions imposed under the cap and trade part of the bill, new coal-fired facilities must reduce carbon dioxide emissions by 50% if they're permitted if they were permitted between 2009 and 2020, and by 65% if permitted after 2020. This is an additional standard. This amendment would just simply create uniformity as to how coal and other electric generating units are treated. The performance standards imposed on natural gas, for instance, would be the same standard on coal if this amendment was allowed. And I'd yield time to Mr. Stearns.
I thank my colleague. The amendment I have, my colleagues, is dealing with carbon capture and sequestration. To commercially develop this, we need to have a liability framework. Must be in place to encourage investment. Mr. Boucher talked about relative to carbon capture and sequestration. He's talking about the Pitts Amendment. Well, if we're going to go ahead, as Mr. Waxman, the chairman, talked about with carbon fuel burning plants, then we need to have carbon capture and sequestration liability reform framework in place. So the amendment authorized the EPA to develop and promulgate regulations for states to apply, be approved for, and administer a state carbon dioxide storage program, and allows for an approved state regulatory agency to establish all rules and regulation with respect to the administration and enforcement of such a program. Each storage operator will be required by the state regulatory agency or the administrator to have and maintain financial assurance necessary to cover public liability claims relating to the storage facility. So important if we're going to go forward with carbon capture and sequestration. Upon the issuance of a certificate of completion of injection operations by the state regulatory agency, then the administrator will simply be vested with complete and absolute title and ownership of the storage facility and any stored carbon dioxide at the facility. At this point, where a completion certificate is issued, the storage operator and all generators of any injected carbon dioxide will no longer have further liability associated with the project, and any performance bonds posted by the storage operator will simply be released. Continuing monitoring of the storage facility, including remediation of any well leakage, will become, at this point, the responsibility of the administrator. So for each fiscal year, the administrator will collect an annual assessment from each storage operator that has not obtained a certificate of completion of injection operation. And I yield the rest of my balance to Mr. Pitts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm offering an amendment that merely adds coal and natural gas that is equipped with CCS technology to the definition of the renewable energy resource. Adding CCS coal and natural gas eliminates regional advantages and disadvantages that I believe currently exist in the renewable electricity standard. My state of Pennsylvania is 58% dependent on the use of coal for electricity generation, and nationally, natural gas accounts for 21.6% of the energy we use. Therefore, states that rely heavily on coal and natural gas will be heavily penalized if, after the deployment of CCS, they are not counted in the renewable electricity standard. Adding CCS coal and natural gas to the RES would keep electric bills lower for families across the nation. It would help avoid reliability problems that occur when relying too heavily on intermittent renewables like wind and solar. And CCS coal and natural gas would be zero-emission sources of electricity. It just makes sense that they be added to the RES. With that, I yield back.
Chairman, I withdraw my reservation.
Gentlelady withdraws his reservation. Gentleman, yield back his time.
Mr. Chairman, I just point out that coal is essential to many of our states. In Missouri, more than 80% of our electricity is generated by coal. It powers, as Mr. Pitts said, nearly 50% of all the electricity in the country. We have almost 30% of the global coal reserves, and I hope we can strike a balance between continuing to use fossil fuels while developing new energy technologies. And I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair yields to Mr. Markey.
I thank you. First of all, just let me say that this legislation does more for coal's future than any piece of legislation in a generation. It is going to provide the multi-billion-dollar funding of the research, development, and deployment of the carbon capture and sequestration technology that will make it possible for coal to continue to prosper in a carbon-constrained world. That's the objective of all of those sections that Mr. Boucher and other members negotiated and ultimately had included in this legislation. Tens of billions of dollars to accomplish that goal. But even with all that said and done, coal is not a renewable. Coal is consumed in the actual production of the electricity which is created. That's why we have a separate section for renewables. Renewables have their own section in the legislation, and that is so that we can create a separate set of incentives for the development, not of one or two, but potentially dozens of new technologies that can complement coal and nuclear and hydro and natural gas as a means of generating electricity in our country, but to be able then to export those new technologies as we hope to export the carbon capture and sequestration technology that we develop under the coal sections of this bill. But to merge two separate concepts, coal, a non-renewable, although ultimately with a little bit of scientific and technological breakthrough, a low carbon emitting technology, yes, and to merge that with renewable technologies, which are going to be incentivized in a different part of the legislation, would be to pervert the goals that we have for both. And so right now, I think it's pretty clear what is happening. There is an all-out assault here on the renewables standards in this bill. And I understand the historic opposition that has been raised against it. But no longer is it possible to say that we are attempting to harm the coal industry, because that is not true. And this legislation is demonstrable evidence of that. I do not think that we could receive the support of the mine workers if they believe that, of Mr. Boucher and the coal state members who have negotiated these provisions. So I urge in the strongest possible terms the rejection of this amendment. Otherwise, I am afraid we would no longer have our balanced policy, but we would have our renewable electricity standard gobbled up by coal, even if it was clean coal. We don't have to do that. We have a way here in this legislation of ensuring that we're doing both. And that ultimately is what the American people want us to do.
Will the gentleman yield?
I urge a no vote on this legislation. And may I yield to the gentleman from Pennsylvania on this issue, Mr. Doyle?
Will the gentleman yield to me first?
I'd be glad to yield.
And then maybe to the other members who seek recognition. These performance standards are necessary to level the playing field, prevent a large emissions legacy from uncontrolled plants, and to ensure that the use of revenues for CCS bonus allowances is wise and pays off. The new subsidies ensure that CCS is a viable option for developers, and the new source performance standard ensures that a clear signal is sent to banks and utilities that CCS is the technology of choice when it comes to coal. So I would join you in urging a defeat of this amendment.
Will the gentleman yield?
I thank the gentleman, and I'll be glad to yield.
Will the gentleman from Massachusetts perhaps help me out? Wouldn't you agree that to go ahead with carbon capture and sequestration, that we have to commercially develop a liability framework to encourage this investment? Without that liability framework, no one's going to expend the capital?
Okay. Actually, at our hearing, which I think the gentleman was at, the insurance industry testified that they are actually developing private sector insurance to cover this entire area, and I think we should allow the private sector insurance industry to first have an opportunity to develop their own approach.
All time has expired on the amendment. You want to vote? Now we will have a recorded vote on the 3 amendments en bloc, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Waxman.
No.
Mr. Waxman votes no. Mr. Dingell. Mr. Dingell votes no. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey votes no. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Gordon votes no. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes no. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo votes no. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Stupak votes no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel, no. Mr. Green. Ms. Saget. Ms. Saget, no. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, no. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle, no. Ms. Harmon. Ms. Harmon, no. Ms. Schakowsky. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez votes no. Mr. Inslee. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Wiener. Mr. Wiener, no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Melanson, no. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow, no. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill votes no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, no. Mrs. Christensen. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes, no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Space. Mr. Space votes aye. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney, no. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton, no. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley, no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton, aye. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall votes aye. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton, aye. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns, aye. Mr. Deal. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes aye. Mr. Shattuck. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt votes aye. Mr. Boyer. Mr. Boyer votes aye. Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Radonovich votes aye. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes aye. Ms. Bono-Mack. Ms. Bono-Mack votes aye. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden, aye. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes aye. Mrs. Myrick. Mrs. Myrick votes aye. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Murphy, Pennsylvania. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Burgess. Ms. Blackburn. Ms. Blackburn votes aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey, aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, aye. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Boucher votes no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes no. Mr. Kowski. Mr. Kowski, no. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee votes no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson, aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Shattuck. Mr. Shattuck votes aye.
Have all members responded to the vote? Ms. Christensen?
Not recorded, Mr. Chairman. Mrs. Christensen votes no.
Clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 23 ayes and 33 noes.
23 ayes, 33 noes. The amendment is not agreed to.